It is high noon for the U.S. Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court grappling with a case that could challenge voting rights in heavily minority districts. Today, the court suggested support of two Arizona ballot restrictions. The arguments center around the 1965 Voting Rights Act and come at a time when Republican-controlled states are considering new restrictions that could make it harder for minorities to vote in next year's elections. So with us now to discuss today's hearing and what's at stake is Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr. Greg, it's great to have you join us today. What did you learn from today's arguments overall?
Well, as you said, I learned that these two restrictions in Arizona will probably survive. One of them is a criminal ban on what critics call ballot harvesting, that is, collecting ballots from somebody else unless you're a family member or a postal carrier, and also a policy that says that we're going to reject ballots that are cast in the wrong precinct. We also learned that the justices didn't seem to be inclined towards a really sweeping test. A number of justices on both sides seem to be trying to find a bit of a middle ground so that some policies like this, if they had a clear and major impact on minority voting, could still be struck down under the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, interesting. So we'll see how that plays out when the decision comes out. I wonder, though, is anyone or did anyone make any references to the 2020 election, which, of course, Donald Trump contested because he was alleging that there's widespread fraud in states where he lost close races. Is anyone talking about that at all as for the reason why you need to reduce the prospect or the risk of fraud in voting?
There was no mention at all of the 2020 election. It was, of course, the backdrop to this whole thing, and clearly was on people's minds. There were certainly references to fraud and the idea that, particularly with the third-party ballot collection, the rationale behind the law is that it reduces fraud if you don't have other people involved in collecting ballots and delivering them to the election office. But that was as close as they came. There were no references specifically to Donald Trump, no references specifically to the 2020 election.
Of course, three of the justices presiding over the case are those who were appointed by President Trump, and we heard from the newest justice, Amy Coney Barrett. Can you give us any idea of what her thinking is on this?
Well, she was one of the justices who seemed to be trying to find a middle ground in the case. She was challenging two different lawyers arguing for the Republican side in the case, one arguing for the Arizona Republican Party. She said that his argument had some contradictions in it. She also questioned the assertion by the Arizona Attorney General, who's also a Republican. His argument was that you have to look at overall voting opportunities for people, including racial minorities, and not just at a particular practice that might have a disproportionate impact on minority voters. And she pushed back on that, saying, hey, if there's a practice that is clearly discriminatory, why shouldn't that be a problem under the Voting Rights Act?
Where does the Biden administration stand on this case? It apparently didn't take part in today's argument and, in fact, agrees that Arizona's voting laws don't actually violate the Voting Rights Act, which I thought was curious.
Yeah, it's an interesting position, and it comes because, no doubt in part, because the Biden administration didn't have a whole lot of time. This is less than 6 weeks after the inauguration. The Trump administration had already filed a brief in the case, and they backed the Arizona restrictions, and they laid out what they thought should be the test under the Voting Rights Act for looking at restrictions like this. And the Biden administration decided that we're just going to file a letter with the court, say we don't actually agree with the rationale that the Trump administration put forth, but actually we do agree that these laws are fine under the Voting Rights Act, and that may be that certainly gives the court a path to a decision that would strike down uphold the provisions and perhaps be able to say, look, we were just agreeing with the Biden administration.
Gotcha. So as we mentioned, no decision is expected on this case until June at the earliest. But one thing I find also really interesting is all the arguments are being held through telephone because of the pandemic. And that's been the case for a while now. I just wonder, from your perspective, how that changes the proceedings.
It changes it a lot for two reasons. Probably the biggest one is that instead of it being kind of a free-for-all, where oftentimes the justice who's really bothered by something will be the first one to ask a question, and then you'll really see what's on his or her mind, they ask questions in order. So it starts with the Chief Justice, and then it goes down in seniority order. And Justice Barrett, since she's the newest justice, is always the last one to ask a question. And so it may be that the things she was thinking about asking, somebody else already asked before. And then, of course, you don't have the in-person body language that you get when everybody is in the courtroom, and that's important both for the lawyers and the other justices and the press watching it. You can pick up some clues about what's going on by watching, in addition to just listening, and we don't have that anymore.
Yeah, so we're missing out on some perhaps important markers there. Greg Stohr, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.